Hello, everyone. Welcome to our daily devotion. Today is Friday, June 19th, and our devotion text comes from Mark chapter 1, verse 23 through 28. I want to ask you a question before we get into our text. Have you ever been excited to brag on someone? Maybe it's your kids for something they've done in school or in sports. Maybe it's your spouse or someone, a friend of yours or family member for maybe a job promotion or something really awesome that's going on in your life. Maybe you've met somebody famous and you couldn't wait to go tell the whole world about this famous person you saw or met based on how awesome they are. For me, I remember standing on the sidewalk outside of a hotel in Memphis going to watch an NBA basketball game with Brittany, and Shaquille O'Neal walked out. He was playing with the Cleveland Cavaliers at the time. I was so excited because I was an arm's length away from Shaquille O'Neal. And I couldn't wait to call my friends and tell them how excited I was to meet Shaquille O'Neal. I want to challenge you today through these verses, through these teaching points, that Christ is to be boasted in far greater than Shaq, far greater than our spouses, far greater than even our own children. We should look to boast in the cross of Christ. We should boast in what God has done through Jesus in saving us and the promises that He has made. And we should boast in that and be able to go proclaim that, and can't wait to share people with that, with other people, the truth of the gospel. And so Mark chapter 1, verse 23 says this: "And immediately there was in the synagogue a man with an unclean spirit. And he cried out, What have you done He cried out, What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." But Jesus rebuked him, saying, "Be silent and come out of him." And the unclean spirit, convulsing him and crying out with a loud voice, came out of him. And they were all amazed, so that they questioned among themselves, saying, "What is this? A new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits, and they obey him." And at once his fame spread everywhere throughout all the surrounding region of Galilee. And so Jesus was teaching in the synagogue. He had just called his first disciples, Andrew, Simon, John, and James. He was walking along the Sea of Galilee, and he called those four disciples to follow him. And he goes into the synagogue and he starts teaching. He goes into the Jewish temple, he starts teaching. And this man with this unclean spirit comes in pretty much pestering Jesus. And Jesus calls this unclean spirit and says, "Get out of him, go." And the people who saw, Jews, who were all Jews, were amazed at this teaching. They had lived off tradition and what had been going on for centuries in the temple. And all of a sudden, this new teacher, this new teaching comes in with this great power that even the unclean spirits obey him. So we understand really quick in this verse that Jesus is God. That Jesus has the divine power of God. And so when Jesus calls out these unclean spirits, he's not doing this just as an earthly human or earthly man. He is doing this with the power and authority of God and teaching that. And so the real point of these verses is to see the end of the story. That his fame spread. That people had saw what he had done. And his fame and his notoriety spread. Now, certainly not Jesus' intention that he should just be worldly famous, but that his gospel should be proclaimed is his intention. His good news should be proclaimed. And so we as Christians, first point I want to make, we as Christians have been exposed to what God has done. We can look through the pages of Scripture and we can see the history. We can see the amazing works of God. We can see the hand of God moving miraculously through the pages of Scripture, and no more miraculous than the story of the gospel, the story that God's Son stepped off the throne of glory, stood on this earth, taught, lived a perfect life, but most importantly, died innocently on a cross and was raised to life 3 days later, his body ascending into heaven. We can look back at the pages of Scripture and we can have full confidence in knowing what God has done. And so that's something that James, John, Simon, and Andrew didn't have. They didn't have any privy to. They were experiencing all this for the first time. And so hindsight being 2020, we can look back at what God has done and have been given a front row seat to that. And so as followers of Christ, number one, as followers of Christ, we have been exposed to what Jesus has already done, which goes into conjunction with our number 2 point. As followers of Christ, we have been given the promise of what God will do. Now, when we talk about what God will do, oftentimes we think God's going to, heal me. God's going to fix my mortgage. God's going to, take away my pain. And that's not what I'm talking about. When I'm talking about what God will do, and that His promise of heaven. What God has done is made a way for us to go to heaven. He has given us the only way to salvation, the only path to Him, and that comes through Jesus Christ. And so what God will do is honor His promise, which is an amazing thing. God is always faithful. Now, we make promises, and people we know make promises, and being honest, when we hear somebody make us a promise, we don't always trust that. And for good reason. We break promises more often than we keep them, I feel. And so we are skeptical to understand somebody keeping their promise. But when we understand the nature of God, that He is always faithful, He is always righteous, He is always good, He is always virtuous, He is the highest point of virtue. When we understand that about God, then all of a sudden Him making a promise is a really big deal. So not only are we privy to what He's done, and we know His testimony, we know the testimonies of God, the statutes of God, the commands of God that go out and are never changed. But we now have those testimonies as the basis to understand the promises of God, that what God promises, what He says He will do, He never breaks that promise, which is really powerful. And so we can now move on to step 3, understanding who God is, what He's done. We move on to step 3, that we as followers of Christ have been challenged to proclaim Him. So just as Jesus was made famous through what He had done, and so much more He would do later in the gospel, we are challenged now to proclaim Him. We are challenged to brag on Him. We are challenged to share with Him with the amount of fervency and sincerity and excitement that we would share with our friends, that if we met a famous celebrity, or if our kids did something really awesome, or if our spouses did get a promotion, we are challenged even more so to boast in the cross of Christ. So I want to challenge you. I hope you have a great weekend, but I want to challenge you as parents to be more excited about sharing Jesus than you are any other good news, because it's the best news. The gospel is the best news. To be more excited to share with friends and family and coworkers, you adults listening to this, teenagers listening to this, to be more excited to share with your friends what God has done, what He will do, and proclaim that to its fullness. And so I want to challenge anybody that listens, this great challenge that God has put before us, to make Him famous, to give Him the glory, to deny self, to pick up our cross, and as we said yesterday, and to make Him famous. And so this is Brother Daniel. I hope you have a great weekend. Can't wait to worship with you Sunday. And may God bless